So, although generally I'm interested in providing an overview of, the particular relationship between the Christian Israelite Church and the development of theology, what I was asked to speak on today was something very specific and important to the history of Christianity, and that is the topic of the apocalypse or the eschaton, the doctrines of the last days. And I think it's very important to remember that throughout Christian history, the vast majority of people believed in an imminent return and or complete overtaking of the world as it exists today, and that would be superseded by divine grace. And this idea, this eschaton, that there is a set period that marks the beginning and end of a biblical time, and that would be overcome with the appearance of the Messiah and the reformation of the world. That's what I want to talk about today, and specifically to introduce you to some theological language, some historical information that will help you to understand the central importance of eschatology, millenarianism, and apocalypticism in the Christian tradition. So Christian reflection on last things, so said the eschaton, has always braided three prominent strands or traditions. So the first is apocalypticism, a conviction that God will unveil a hidden moral order through crisis and judgment. Secondly, we have millenarianism, the expectation of a transformative age, often keyed to a 1,000-year reign. And finally, we have eschatology, the broader theological account of ultimate destiny. Apocalypticism comes from the Greek word apokalypsis, meaning unveiling, and it typically stresses imminent divine intervention, judgment, and the vindication of the faithful. It has shaped Christian imagination since the New Testament, and really even well before to the Jewish Second Temple period, and it has shaped Christian imagination throughout all of this times. And its principal idea is that things of the world as they are now understood will be overcome, they will be shown for what they truly are, and then this is part of the final revelation of God. So that's the apocalyptic element. Now, speaking more narrowly, millenarianism focuses on a distinct period of earthly renewal, and it's drawn from Revelation chapter 20 and has been variably interpreted as either literal or symbolic across Christian history. And the mille part in millenarianism is the 1,000 years. So this is the doctrine that for a 1,000-year period, there will be the reign of Christ on earth and the overcoming of Satan. And finally, we have the theological area of study, which is a discipline in itself called eschatology, which surveys the entire arc of Christian tradition: death and resurrection, the second coming, final judgment, heaven and hell, as well as the new creation. And these three lenses have generated powerful theological, liturgical, and especially political meanings for Christian communities across time. And I've always stressed that in any talk, that to imagine or to claim to know about divine reality is always a political statement, and it comes with political weight. So now let's talk a little bit about the scriptural roots and the early doctrine of Christian expectation. So Christian apocalypticism grows out of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature, which framed communal suffering, particularly the Babylonian captivity, under foreign empires as part of a cosmic timetable, leading to divine judgment and restoration. Texts such as Daniel, passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel, and the intertestamental works like First Enoch forged a repertoire of symbols: beasts and thrones, a son of man, heavenly books, ascents, etc., etc., that would saturate early Christian visions and interpretations. This tradition provided both critique of oppressive power and hope for God's decisive rectification of history, themes that deeply inform the New Testament's own apocalyptic speech and imagery. And the Gospels, Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God is threaded with eschatological urgency, especially in the discourse around the Olivet sermons, which is Mark 13. The parallel for that you can find in Matthew 20 and 25, and then finally Luke 21, where he speaks of tribulations. He, being Jesus, speaks of tribulations, watchfulness, and the coming of the Son of Man. Many scholars in what you would call third quest identity see Jesus as primarily an eschatological prophet who anticipated the inbreaking reign of God within a generation, a living generation. Others included advocates of realized or inaugurated eschatology, which emphasized that in Jesus' ministry and paschal mystery, the end has already begun. The New Testament also preserves tensions about timing, expectation, nearness, the unknown hour, and the Gospel's repeated attempts to encourage patience. While Revelation chapter 20's vision of Satan bound and the saints reigning provided the textual seedbed for later millenarial doctrines. And to add to the Gospel writings, the Apostle Paul shares this horizon of expectation, consoling the Thessalonians specifically with the promise that we who are alive will be caught up to meet the Lord. And that comes from 1 Thessalonians verse 4, a passage that has anchored multiple eschatological schemas. Yet his letters also register development. Hope remains urgent, but the horizon stretches as his vision unfolds, as we start seeing in the later writings of the Apostle Paul, where he says, there is a time frame that we are dealing with, and then which is more expanded than what he originally had thought. And the book of Revelation it probably is the final apocalyptic text, and truly the predominant apocalyptic text in the New Testament. It tells the story of the gathering of Israel's prophetic drama into a visionary sequence of judgment and triumph, culminating in the millennium, the final defeat of evil, and the advent of a new heaven and a new earth. Imagery whose interpretation would become a central fault line in the development of Christian theology. So that's just sort of a background of what each one of those terms means and what importance they have. Now, when we talk about the millennium in the context of Christian thought more generally, is the second point that I'd like to speak to. So Revelation 20 depicts a 1,000-year period during which the martyrs live and reign with Christ, while Satan is bound, followed by Satan's brief loosing, the final judgment, and the renewal of all things. Across the tradition, Christians have passed this millennium in three ways. The first is premillennialism, the belief that Christ will return before an actual or a renewed golden age, a return to Eden. We have postmillennialism, that believes that Christ's return after a spirit-wrought or a spirit-created era of gospel peace. And finally, we have amillennialism, that the 1,000 years is a symbolic representations of Christ's current reign in and through the church until the final consummation in the last judgment. These views differ in how they locate the church's mission within history and the extent to which they anticipate a visible terrestrial transformation prior to the final judgment. Patristic, meaning early church fathers, and medieval interpretation gradually elevated symbolic readings. Augustine's influential amillennialism reinterpreted the millennium as the present age of the church, with the binding of Satan signifying the curbing of his power through Christ's victory, and the first resurrection understood spiritually. This move both tempered literal, kielistic hopes and grounded Christian hope in a sacramental and ecclesial life, while still orientating it toward the final judgment and resurrection. Augustine's synthesis set a durable trajectory for Latin Christianity and Western Christianity generally. For it set the trajectory for that area's Christian interpretations in their own image of the final days. That said, early post-apocalyptic currents retained literal millennial hopes in some quarters, and this is especially in Asia Minor, where Paul descends. Reading Revelation's imagery as a concrete, forthcoming earthly reign of Christ and the saints. Over time, wider ecclesial teaching emphasized the spiritual kingdom inaugurated by Christ and treated Kielism with caution, noting the difficulty of pressing apocalyptic imagery into precise timetables and the absence of explicit Kielistic teachings in the Gospel or in the letters of Paul. This caution aimed to safeguard both moral vigilance and doctrinal sobriety amid the various speculative ideas of the end of the age. So the church very much tried to preserve the belief in the final atonement, but was very unhappy with particularly enthusiastic or populist movements that embraced that. And then let's talk about a little bit beyond the early church fathers, into the current period where we're living now, just to give you sort of a survey of the different ideas that were being communicated during this time. So eschatology, again, the doctrine of the final days, threads through early Christian literature beyond the New Testament. Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen each developed themes of parousia, the restoration, resurrection, and judgment, even as they diverged in method and emphasis. The discipline itself received its technical name later, but the loci of this particular doctrine of the second coming and its connected themes of resurrection, judgment, and new creation were formative in preaching, catechesis, meaning education, and controversy from the beginning. Medieval apocalyptic imagination remained vivid with figures like Joachim of Fiore advancing influential and controversial readings of what he called salvation history that anticipated a new spiritual age. Joachim's triadic schema, based on Trinitarian ideas, presented expectations of imminent transformation within the Church, shaping later medieval reform movements and debates over historical providence. These currents reveal how apocalyptic symbolism could energize programmatic visions of ecclesial renewal and historical meaning beyond a narrow fixation on the in-date prediction. In the early modern and modern periods, Protestant traditions elaborated distinct millennial frameworks. 18th and 19th century Anglophone Protestantism saw robust postmillennial optimism amongst many groups, Puritans included, promoters of radical reform, the early Baptist movement, the Anabaptist movement, and our own, the South Cottian descended. And in another stream, the rise of premillennial in the words of many very, very difficult words, premillennial dispensationalism is the word I was trying to say, through figures like John Nelson Darby, who emphasized a soon returning figure of Christ, a distinct rapture, and a very understandable prophetic timetable, where he broke things down as seeing some things as necessary, some things as optional, etc. So both trajectories catalyzed missionary zeal and shaped global Christian movements, while also refracting wider cultural hopes and anxieties in eschatological idioms. And this is particularly the case in the 17th century, where people's hope for people's ideals about how to improve society more generally were often cast in very explicitly religious forms. The 20th century renewed academic eschatology with theologians such as Jürgen Moltmann, Wolfhard Pannenberg, recovering eschatology as the horizon of all doctrine, resurrection as history's open future, hope as a critique of the present, and the promises of God as the final grammar of Christian praxis. This eschatolization of theology sought to move beyond speculative chronologies, such as those provided by Darby, toward a constructive account of God's future as the dynamic center of the Christian faith and ethics. So now let's talk for a little bit about some of these connections between developing political movements and the hope of the millennium. Millenarian movements, whether religious or secular, commonly diagnose the present order as irredeemably corrupt and expect only a dramatic crisis to effect transformation. Sociologically, they often envision a sequence of intensifying oppression, active resistance by the faithful, and a decisive transition into a purified age in which the elect are vindicated. Such patterns have surfaced across many different cultures and eras, showing that millennial expectation is as much a social force as a theological claim, with profound implications for communal identity, moral discipline, and political engagement. Christian history shows apocalyptic energy repeated by spilling into reform and revolutionary imaginaries. At times, apocalypticism has energized movements for justice and liberation.
Watch it. Don't. I can't understand this. I was actually thinking of going home.
Okay. Okay. An empire in summons to hopeful struggle in the present. Modern political theologies, liberation theology in particular, have retrieved eschatological motifs to frame the Exodus, the prophets, and the resurrection as God's pledge to the oppressed, while warning against violent or technocratic utopianism that foreclose divine freedom. This line of reflection probes how Christian hopes both affirms God's ultimate future and disciplines the penultimate or final projects of the church. Apocalyptic motifs also circulate in secular imaginaries, such as climate catastrophe, technological singularities, the issues with AI, civilizational collapse, testifying to a human appetite for the unveiling of divine judgment beyond explicitly religious claims. While such narratives lack the theological center of a divine or promised new creation, they often borrow apocalyptic form to articulate crisis and meaning. The porous boundaries between religious and secular apocalypticism underscore how eschatological grammar migrates across cultural domains, sometimes sharpening ethical urgency, sometimes fueling fatalism or conspiracyism. And as we see right now, in this current moment, there is a greater degree of people who are interested in eschatological language, but primarily in terms of political um, points. So, as I've tried, and perhaps this is obviously we got one rather pronounced down vote. Um, what I'm trying to do is provide the most cogent introductions possible for a central doctrine of the Christian Church, which is the imminence of God's return. And although this idea has been sort of condensed through more mainstream churches, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, etc., it's sort of seen as an eventuality, but not necessarily, it does not carry the sort of extreme presentness that it did in the New Testament. And that's something that is very important to remember, that for the New Testament writers, the coming of God's kingdom was imminent, and it was the thing of of importance to the early gospel. So within this mix, debates about the imminence of the kingdom remain alive. Some scholars argue that Jesus and Paul expected the end within their generation, while others advancing realized or inaugurated theologies hold that the decisive turning point of the ages has already occurred in Christ and is presently mediated by the Spirit and the Church, awaiting consummation at the parousia, or the Great Restoration. The New Testament's own plurality in its terms of the apocalyptic and the promises of nearness, its warnings that only the Father knows about the hour, and exhortations to be vigilant and patient, have generated a spectrum of interpretive balance between urgency and endurance and the concept of the already and not yet. So I think that we'll go back here and we'll see if there are questions or anything to develop from that point. I'm realizing now maybe that was a little bit more technical than I had originally wanted, but there we have it. Hello. And anytime you're talking on one of these things, it's quite scary. You don't know if you've gone off at any point and no one can hear you.
Any questions? Anyone online? Anyone in the any questions?
Still digesting it, Del.
I'm millennial.
It's not a secret country somewhere. Yeah, maybe Del might like to just make a comment about how the Bible has actually played a part in most of the how strongly they've stuck to the people's understanding of the Bible, which shows that there's lots of different understandings as opposed to different documents that have been written by other theologians. Yes.
What did so could you restate one more time? That way I'm very that way I know exactly. So
Yes. I guess basically, Del, the importance that the Bible has played in all the prominent different differentiations of the picture.
in that sense, okay. Really to talk about 20th century, to talk about Western society in general, is to talk about the Bible. The Bible has been the source of most it's the source of dominant ethics, even amongst people who do not recognize Christianity as such. It has become the primary framework that provides understandings about who people are, what it means to be an individual, what it means to be human. The Bible is the text of Western civilization. And it is very, very complicated. The book, and actually you find this very often in 19th century Christian writings, that the Bible itself is often depicted primarily in terms of its mystery, its complexity, and this idea that it illustrates not just what has happened, but what will happen. And that's the entire study of the eschatological goal. And although I used language that was maybe a little more technical than what I meant to say, the way that people have thought about the end has profoundly influenced the way that human beings have lived for an exceptionally long period of time. And that when you look back to the 16th century or even earlier to the very beginning of the Protestant Reformation, this idea that we are living in the time of the end and that we require an eschatological approach has been really centralized in their response. And that in some ways, so as I've said, that Western society, the Bible is the foundational text of Western society, so also it must be added that apocalypticism and the expectation of the end have been the primary motivations for Western political ideology. Does that help? Sorry, Rodney. I know you threw me a bone there. Let's see if it worked.
Del, it's Karen.
Yeah. Hi, Karen.
For anyone that was alive at the end of the turn of the century, which isn't that long ago, we all went through that. The number of people who said the end of the world is coming, the Mayan calendar, Reverend Sun Moon and all his mates in the Philippines and everywhere else. it was always going to be the end of the world, 1999, 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. So, as you're saying, none of this is new. This is
No.
simply people not understanding, anticipating an end, and wanting to know a time. You know, if I build my house now, should I take out a 20-year loan or should I take out only a 5-year loan? And, you know,
Yes.
and the Bible says, you know, we should live like we don't know when the time is going to be.
It's yes.
And, you know, anyone that lived through the late 90s, early 2000s, it always happens at the turn of every 100 years and at the turn of every millennium, the same fear happens. All of mankind is this the end?
Very, very true. And so in my own research, you know, considering European Christian groups, there have been, I think, something like 2,000, about 2,500 predictions of the end of the age by various Protestant movements from the 16th century on. And the interesting thing about all of that is that very often, and I think the issues that we saw in Y2K and a lot of these other phenomenon about, you know, the Mayan apocalypse in 2012, all of these ideas that came from that, really reflects this profound uncertainty about social development. Now there is, I mean, it's not a marginal opinion. It's discussed in, you know, the major newspapers around the world. It's a fear, but this discussion about what role AI is going to have in the development of the future, and people are imagining, you know, apocalyptic scenarios today where AI takes over everything and brings about some kind of march toward ending human civilization. So yes, these motifs, these ideological constructs, are very much wedded to human ideas and imaginaries more generally. And when you study them, you know, sometimes they're very odd, but if you use that as sort of a view, you know, I'm a historian, I'm interested in how people thought about things in the past. So if you use eschatology, so people's view of the end of days, as a reflection of their own times, I think it's profoundly interesting. And yes, it's one of the most easy to misunderstand elements of religious history, particularly when you're dealing with apocalyptic groups, because people are very quick to humiliate and to sort of shame people for having this hope. But what I think is it's infinitely more complex. And it really requires a great deal of sifting and cultural sensitivity to understand that material. But thank you. And by the way, I loved your testimony, by the way.
Right, thank you, Del. That's time. Really appreciate you staying up late for us over there in Chicago and presenting to us and sharing.
No worries.
Okay.